Thank you. And good morning, brothers and sisters. Thank you. Well, our studies yesterday brought us to this verse here where King Balak sends more powerful, more honourable, more influential princes and nobles with more money in their pockets to put more pressure on Balaam. Why? Because he didn't deal with the struggle. He didn't deal with the temptation from the beginning. He left that door open. He left it ajar just enough for temptation to be able to come in. And let me clarify, if I may. Yesterday, I think I said that temptation always comes through a door left open. No, it may. And it may because we've probably left that door open because we want it open. And so God works with us and will often give us what we really want. And that, I guess, is the theme, the overarching principle that we're going to see in these next few verses of Balaam's life. God will give us the desires of our heart, not that he wants to. And we're going to see that God is angry with Balaam for the way he goes. But our God will give us what we want. And our story sort of follows this line that Balaam has had these new nobles and elders who have come and they've spent the night there with him because he wanted to know if he could find a verse that he could justify, twist, manipulate to be able to do what he wanted to do. That's the modern translation of Balaam's life. He turned to God in prayer asking if there was something more than the clear message that he'd been given in verse 12. Don't go, don't curse them, I'm blessing them. It can't be any clearer than that. And God gives us everything we need here. Everything that we need. But it's often not enough, is it? Because it's different in my life. It's different because of whatever it is that we're struggling with, that we're trying to justify in our life. And that's where Balaam's at. I want us just to think about that for a minute, because God comes to Balaam that night and says to him, if the men call you, rise, go with them, but only do what I told you to do. Only speak the things that I tell you to speak. And we're bound by that. God lets us have the experiences and lets us do the things that we want to do. But in the end, we are always bound by this statement of do or say what God requires of us. Now, there's a bit of misunderstanding here in the different translations around that word if. It's an important word, and I think the King James translation gets it correct. I think what it's saying is, if the men wake up in the morning and they come to you and they do call you, then go. But equally, some translations will present it to say, well, if the men have come for you, then you go. But don't forget, obey me first. And Balaam knows that principle, doesn't he? He says that from the beginning. Even if Balak gave me a house full of silver and gold, I can't go against the word of my God. So there's a bit of a challenge between the different translations as to exactly what's going on here in this little verse. What I think happens is that God came to Balaam that night and says, if the men call you, rise up, go with them, but only do what I say. So Balaam is up super early, before the sun's up. He's up at 6 a.m, maybe even 4 a.m. He's packing his bags, he's getting everything organised, and he's standing at the door of the princess saying, come on, let's go. I've got my hall pass. I've found justification to do what I want to do. He hasn't let God work. He's found what he wants. He's found a path. He's found a solution. And as a result, God is angry. Why? Because, as I've just added the word just, and I think it's supported, he just went. He had no intention of letting God lead. Now, I ask you in your lives, brothers and sisters, have you done that? I don't need an answer. Maybe plan to buy a new house. You say, I'll commit to God in prayer. And then you overspend, undersell, buy more, whatever it may be. Maybe you're on the AB and you've gone to a meeting with all this idea in your mind of what the ecclesia needs to do, and you've opened that prayer or the AB meeting in prayer with little care or thought what God really wants to be achieved in that meeting, and you're going to push your agenda. And it's disastrous. We do it in lots of ways in life, don't we? We say we'll pray to God, we'll leave it in His hands, but then do the very best we can to turn every possible stone to achieve what we want to achieve in our life. And God's not happy with that. You know, sometimes we say, well, I committed it to God in prayer, and He didn't answer me. He did answer. In verse 12, He told Balaam. He told him what he should do. And if we're honest, we know the answer. But we don't want the answer, do we? We want to find a way. And that's because Balaam is controlled by his lusts. He's owned by what he's seen. He loves the wages of unrighteousness. And it's got him. He's blinded by the promises that this world can offer, and he can't see or hear what God is trying to say to him. You know, he's so blinded that he's going to have a conversation with his donkey. He's going to have a D&M with his truck about the way that he wants to go. And I'm sure you've stood in ecclesial life at some point and watched a very dear friend do some dumb things because they're so obsessed with doing what they want to do that they won't listen to God, to you, to anybody. And that's the story of Balaam this morning. I could sit down, but let's develop that. Let's find that in the story. Let's see how that all comes out. Let's follow it through. So Numbers 22, verse 20 to 22, we have this tricky little section where there's a bit of translation struggle. It just really is. What's the question? Why did God apparently change his mind? What was it? Well, what I want to also address at this point is there comes a point where God works with us. He works with us, and he works with us to the point where God finally gives us up. And yes, Romans chapter 1 is an extreme verse, but it validates the fact that there is a point where God gives up and says, well, go your own way. Now, where does that grey line begin and where does it end? I'm going to leave that for you to decide whether that's in chapter 22 or that's in chapter 23. You've got to decide that, because your life will be different to my life, and that's why we've got no right to judge one another, because we don't know. But there comes a point where God turns around and says, well, if you want to go, then just go. But you know, I think what God was actually wanting to do is provide an opportunity here for him to influence the situation. If the men come knocking on your door in the morning, Balaam, and just wait for that, then go. Can you think a biblical precedent of that in the scripture? Where a king under great pressure from an army outside laid it all before God and woke up in the morning. His problem was gone. Because 145,000 men were dead. God could do things if we but will let him work. If we will but let him and be patient to let him lead. But I think Balaam was up and he was off first thing in the morning, and so the anger of God was there, just was against him because he simply went. And so there comes a point where God says, well, listen, you go your own way. You have free will. And that's the greatness of our God. It's his rights. And he gives us that privilege of being able to choose and direct our destiny. He'll discourage us. He'll appeal to us. And we're going to see that in Balaam's life. But we can ignore that. And so what we'll see is that providence works subtly, it works gently, and then it works firmly, and then finally it gives us a slap in life, to put it that way, to stop us. If we won't listen and we won't respond, in the end, God will give up. And what we'll see is that God's going to use Balaam as just a tool, as a pawn in his hands to achieve his purpose. Because his purpose will remain constant. His purpose will be achieved. But we have the free will to choose whether we'll be on his side or the world's side. We have that choice, and God can work with us in his greatness on either side. And so as Romans says, or says later in Romans, that we can be a vessel fit for destruction. And it's God's right to use us in ecclesial life for good or for evil. And I struggled with that personally for a long time. How God can bless somebody who's motivated by the wrong things and can achieve incredible things from them. But in the end, they were a vessel that wasn't going to respond. It's hard to come to terms with. And that's part of what this story of Balaam helped me to learn. It's the same thing for us, and God is consistent in the way he works. God's principles are consistent. They really are. You might be having that question in your mind, but saying, hang on, Jared, God just changed his mind. God said, don't go. And now God's saying, well, go. And God said, go. And then he's angry. How does all that work? Well, let's just think through that for a second. Let's think through how God's principles and God's ways are clear. They're unchanging. But whether we're on board or whether we're not on board is what the difference is. And let's use the example of Genesis 12, because Balaam knows that very well. Oh, he knows that. He knows how to use that for good or bad. So Genesis chapter 12 says that I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed. So that's God's purpose. That is unchanged and has been unchanged for thousands of years. And we see that constantly. We saw it in the pogroms last night. The things that would go on in Israel's history. We can follow it down through the scripture. We can follow it down through the history books. Unchanged. The process by which that happens, though, is something that's worth thinking about. Israel is the nation that is to be blessed because of Abraham. Balaam's well aware of that. Israel must enter into the promised land. They're fixed things. They will not change. Israel's on the edge of the promised land and they're looking into the land, and that's where they're at geographically. But before Israel can go into the promised land, God always measures the faithful and tests their commitment, shall we say. Will they obey? Will they follow me? And that's what God's going to do. Now, how that's going to happen is what God is incredibly flexible with. And that's where our lives sit. In the how God's purpose is unravelled. Because God is very flexible with what the temptation is and who it is that brings that temptation into our lives. And God can work with a servant like Balaam. He can work with a servant like Elijah, we're about to read in our readings soon. He can work with Ahab and Omri, or Jezebel. And he can work with Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, to come and invade Israel and destroy Jerusalem. God's right to do all of that. He's right. The question is, how are we going to be part of that? Are we going to be part of God's purpose being fulfilled and be on God's side? Or are we going to choose to be against God? And that's what Balaam's going to come to realise, that he hasn't realised he's crossed over and he's against God now. And we're going to see God use him as a vessel merely fit for destruction, because he will not respond to what God wants him to do. It's better for us to work with God than against him. Now, I stole this little bit of information in the class yesterday, so we'll gloss over that quickly. That there's games going on, but God is in control. Balak, who represents the world, is playing games, trying to promise us and overpromise to us. And Balaam, in response, is equally doing the same things by going back to God and asking more and more and more. But in the end, this little phrase is what it all comes down to, and that's what we must live by. Those principles of God that are boundaries. And we know those principles, they're in God's word for us. And that saying, statement, phrase was not lost on Balaam. We're going to see that pop up. We're going to see it pop up in chapter 22, verse 35, 38, 23, verse 8, verse 12, 24, verse 13. I think Balaam was scared when God said that to him, because he knew that there are boundaries with God. He knew that there's a point of no return. He knew that there was a cross, a point that he could cross. And so for a soothsayer to not be allowed to say what he wants, for a man who's all about smooth words, he's going to feel a little bit inhibited by the fact that he's got to operate within the framework of what God will say or tell him to speak. And we'll see that in chapter 23 more. But just watch out for that phrase. It's going to pop up constantly. And Balaam's going to acknowledge it himself, because I don't think he feels comfortable with it. So let's get into the warnings that God provides to us. And this is the way providence works. Providence works in your life and my life in exactly the same way. God is trying to work with us. And we're going to see the way God works with Balaam on this occasion, and I hope that you'll be able to relate to that. I hope you'll be able to go, yeah, there was an event in my life where I saw that happen, or yes, I saw that in a dear friend. So verse 23, verse 24, verse 26 is the three times that the angel approaches Balaam. And we're going to see a graduation in that, because providence will often warn us like a friend does, before it will then punish us like an enemy. And it depends on how spiritually sensitive we are as to whether we will hear God, or whether we'll only notice when we receive that strike from God, that slap, if I can use that language, where it comes and it strikes us between the eyes. Peter says this. We developed this idea from Peter. Balaam is rebuked for his iniquity. What iniquity has Balaam committed up to this point? The iniquity is that he's pushed God's boundaries. Balaam said nothing wrong, he's done nothing wrong, other than not listen to God trying to direct him. And Peter says that's what Balaam was rebuked for. In fact, a dumbass spoke to him and told him that, and said to him in a man's voice, "You're mad. You are mad, Balaam. You might be a prophet of God, but you're doing dumb stuff." And we see that in our lives. We see it in our dear friends' lives, where they make dumb decisions. That's the divine perspective on his life. Now, we'll come back to it actually. Let's work through these warnings. Verse 23, verse 24, verse 25 is a progression of the road slowly getting narrower and narrower. It depends on your translation as to whether that's shown. Verse 23 talks about standing in the road, and it's a wide open road like this in the first picture. And you can imagine that Balaam's coming along here with his donkey. Did anybody else notice who else is with Balaam? 2 servants. Now I ask you just to think about what those servants thought. Maybe what they heard. How much they observed. And this is where we can pick up the links in Paul's life, because he had servants with him too, and they didn't hear everything. So, extension study for you. But imagine Balaam going along with his servants, and the ass sees up here an angel. Something that strikes the donkey. So much so that the donkey goes, whoa, I'm just going to detour off here through the corn. And we can just keep down under the corn. And Balaam beats the donkey. Get back on the path that I want you to be on. And so the angel of the Lord goes a little bit further down the road. And it stands in a narrow path. Hopefully your translation has that in it. Not all translations pick up this progression, but it's clearly there. Imagine a narrow path, one where there's a wall. There should be a wall on both sides, but forgive me, I couldn't find a picture that just did justice. I found a vineyard on this side. There's a little wall here. And I can imagine Balaam on his donkey here. The angel's up here. And the donkey's like, heck, I want to get around this. And so he pushes over here against this wall. And you can imagine Balaam's foot and ankle getting ground along that limestone wall. It hurt. Cut him. There was a bit of blood. But it was gentle, really. Balaam's life in the end is death by a sword. But Balaam didn't hear it. He got off his donkey and he beat the donkey again. He wasn't hearing it because he's obsessed with what he wants. So we come down to verse 26. The angel of the Lord went a little further ahead and stood in a really narrow place like this. And you can imagine that scenario with the angel standing at the end and the donkey coming around the corner, and it's now caught. It can't go anywhere. And it drops down on the ground. Before we get into that story though, I just want you to focus on that little concept. What does that tell us? The angel knew exactly where Balaam's going. More than that, the angel knew Balaam's needs. The angel knew how to try to help Balaam to respond. And in your life, God does the same thing too. He's always one step ahead. He can go just a little further ahead of you and prepare things for your life to direct you. If we will but listen, spiritually listen, and see what he's saying to us. Well, Balaam won't have a bar of it. Because he gets off his donkey again and beats it. For the third time. Let's stop at that point and examine that in our lives. Bluntly, like an Australian. How much further are we going to push God to justify things, experiences, relationships, pleasures, innocent amusements that are really nothing more than contrivances to forget about him, to get away from him for a little while and go Balaam's way? I don't need the answer. I'm sorry to be so direct. It's Australian. But our God wants us to do that. He wants us to think about that. To be honest with ourselves, because he's trying to work with us in our life. He's told us clearly in verse 12. He's told Balaam exactly what he should do. But he's so flexible. And he's so patient to let us go through life like this. And he's always that one step ahead of us ready. even into the most narrow little bits of life that we find ourselves. But Balaam's donkey just crouches down on that sore foot. Remember that. It's just been hacked up on the limestone wall. And it would have hurt as Balaam had to rest on that foot. But he gets up and beats that donkey again. It's powerless to respond. Now, it's a miracle, really, what God is doing. Don't forget that. And it's a miracle that God is able to open a donkey's eyes. But it's incredible to think that a prophet of Yahweh can't have his eyes opened. We're being told really clearly, aren't we, that we can be more foolish than an ass, more stubborn than a donkey. That's the lesson we're being told. It was a miracle that that donkey could see and could speak. But try to appreciate the lengths that God was going to go to despite our foolish ways, appealing to Balaam's logical and rational mind. Let's work through it. The donkey saw the angel of Yahweh and she lay down under Balaam. And Balaam's anger is kindled against the donkey. For the third time, he strikes the donkey down with his staff. And here's the miracle. Again, another miracle. And the donkey says to Balaam, "What have I done to you? That you've struck me 3 times?" And we laugh. And it's because we do dumb stuff when we're obsessed with something that this world is offering to us, and we just want it, rather than obeying what God says to do. And that's how foolish we are. We have a deep and meaningful conversation with a creature that can't talk. And Balaam just takes it in his stride. He doesn't even see how foolish that is, because he just responds to the donkey and says, "Because you've made a fool out of me." And the donkey would be going, "Bro, listen to yourself. You're talking to me. You're the fool, not me. And just up there is an angel with a sword." But Balaam says, "I wish I had a sword in my hand so I could kill you." And the donkey's going, "Hey, I'm protecting you from the sword." It's funny, but it's not. Because that's what we do. And that's what the story of Balaam's trying to show to us, how silly we are. I mean, we watch an animal walk into a trap because you put some food in front of it and it's so obsessed with having more. It just walks into something that it knows is a risk. You see the lesson we're being taught by this story. He doesn't even realise that he's talking to a donkey. You know, in some ways, you've got to stop, step back, and just think about the angels that were working here. Just think about the emotions of the angels for a second. We were getting a bit too intense. There's an angel that loves Balaam, and his heart is cut. But Balaam's not responding. It's the angel that's working in Balaam's life, trying to help him, trying to lead him. But in other ways, there's other angels who are out there standing and watching. And I'm sure there's a smile on their face as they're just laughing at what's going on in the best possible way. But it's here we see the humour of the way the angels are teaching us in our lives to learn from our mistakes. They have a sense of humour. That's our role in the future, working through these type of scenarios with people. Just grasp that. It's a good thing. Balaam says, "You've made a fool out of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand and I'd kill you." The donkey responds to Balaam and says, and just grasp the logic here. Just grasp it. Am I not your donkey? You bought me because you thought I was good for you. And you've ridden me all your life long. To this day. Is it my habit to treat you this way? Just think about your experiences with me over the last decade. Have I ever done that to you before, Balaam? And Balaam's like, no. But I'm still angry with you. I'm still going to slap you. And you might think, well, I don't have a donkey. Well, who is that donkey? If Balak's the world, and Balaam is a son of God, a worshipper of God, a brother in the ecclesia, who is that lifelong servant working in your life? Ultimately, it's Jesus Christ. Ultimately, absolutely, it's Jesus Christ. But each one of us are meant to be like Jesus Christ. And we're meant to behave like him. We're meant to try to imitate him and manifest the values of our God. So I think the truth is that the parable here of what we're being told is that this donkey is like a faithful, lifelong friend who has always done good things to help you in your life. Picture one in your life. Someone who taught you at Sunday school. Maybe as a teen, you went off the rails a little, and they actually backed you. They helped you. Maybe they taught you first principles. Maybe they were the instrumental people that created an ecclesia, which was a safe place for you to worship God, to learn about God, to experience ecclesial life, to experience the way God works in your life. And they tried to demonstrate that over a decade or more to you as a faithful, lifelong friend. They would have carried you if they could. But there comes a point where they just crouch down in submission because there's nothing else that they can do. They've tried to communicate and tried to gently say to you, it's not the way. And every single time you've turned around and slapped them down and said, what right have you got to criticise me and what I'm doing? Who do you think you are to say that I'm doing something that's wrong? Or maybe we've done it on behalf of our children against a lifelong friend. Protected our children when we know they've crossed a boundary. Maybe you don't physically strike them, but certainly criticise their motive, why they're doing what they're doing. And all they're doing is asking a simple question saying, do you think it's the best way? Notice the question, it's important. Do you think it's the best way to go, Balaam? And our response is like that. You done it? That's how God talking to us. That's how God communicates to us, through loyal, faithful friends. And I say friends because it's not just our brothers and sisters. Listen to your colleagues at work who call you out one day because you didn't behave like your religion tells you to. Don't justify it, own it. See how we can do that? You know, you've got to picture that in your head because it's ugly in the moment. And it's so awkward in the moment. But you've got to face it. You've got to call it for what it is if you've crossed the boundary. You know, ecclesias are full of that. Our ecclesias are full of people that are willing to put their neck on the line because they love you. Flip it around the other way. We've got an older group here in the audience. Would you love to be one of those donkeys? Would you love to be able to do that for somebody else? It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? To be able to help our young people. To share what we've got. To show them the truth. To see like the penny drop and the light go on and they're like, yes, I can see that. It's so rewarding. It is. But heck, expect that you're going to get a slap. Don't get upset. Just calmly crouch down, like that donkey, and accept it. Take it in your stride. It's what our Lord did. It's what we're called to do. But to be able to do that, to be able to be that donkey, you have to be loyal and faithful to others for a long time to build that relationship so that in times of difficulty you can be trusted. That what you say will be gently and beautifully worded to them. And they may not hear it. But that's not our job, to make them hear it. We do our best. In the end, there'll always be some who will choose to be Balaam. To put that same idea into different words, it's Paul who says there's lots of people that will stand up here and rant about all these ideas. You can have many teachers, but there's not many fathers who'll cop that on the chin and take it. That's what Paul says in Corinthians 4 and verse 15. Have a think about that. All right, what's the angel's verdict? So let's keep going. Verse 32. Oh, we should read verse 31, I think. Let's get the context. Verse 30, the donkey said, have I been loyal? Verse 31, God opens the eyes of Balaam's eye. God opened Balaam's eyes. Sorry. That's a miracle. It really is. It's a miracle that a prophet of God finally can see. And he saw the angel of Yahweh standing in the way with his sword drawn in his hand. You know, it looks amazing that he bowed his head and threw himself to the ground, with his face to the ground. And the angel said to him, why are you beating your donkey? See a question? 3 times. I came out to oppose you. What is this that you're doing? The way you are behaving is perverse before me. Yes, we can talk about this being the word for devil, Satan, opposing. Yes, there's some great conversations we can have about it. I want to focus on this little word here about perverse. It's probably the more relevant part. The word perverse is made up of 2 parts. To turn over and to cast away. 2 things. To rashly turn over and push away. And that's what Balaam had done. He turned over the things that God wanted and pushed it aside to go and do what he wanted to do. And that's Balaam's problem. Sometimes we obsess about Balaam's problem being what he does in the next chapters. No. There's the problem. We don't want to go past that. We don't want to go any further than that. But the stories are there for our admonition and for our learning. Let's not find that grey line. Let's stay well clear of that grey line and not rashly push it and cross over, because the result is dangerous. God's saying in verse 33 that he would have killed Balaam if it wasn't for that loyal, faithful friend who interceded in Balaam's life. He would have been dead long ago. Think about that. Think about your role to intercede, to help, to stand with our brothers and sisters as they're struggling. But there's a limit to God's enormous patience, His enormous mercy, His loving kindness. There's a point where God can no longer do anything. And the point is with a man who thinks like this, in verse 34. In verse 34, Balaam's response is, I've sinned. I did not know that you stood against me in the road. So now, if it's evil in your sight, I'll go back home. When I first read that story, I thought, that's incredible. The man just openly admits, I've sinned, I'm wrong, I'll go home. It's a total fake. Just think carefully about what he did say. Balaam's sin is not the fact that he did not know that the angel was standing there. That is not Balaam's sin. Balaam's sin is not his ignorance that an angel was trying to stand in the road against him. Balaam's sin is that he disobeyed and kept pushing and overturning God's command so that he could do what he wanted to do. That's the sin. Balaam doesn't call it what it is. In fact, Balaam uses the classic if. If it's evil in your sight. Did you forget verse 12? He's being told so clearly. But typical Balaam, if, always looking for a way out. Always looking for a way to justify what he wants to do. And haven't we all done that at some point in our lives? Well, here's Balaam who's sold himself at this point to sin. And so the angel of the Lord says to Balaam, listen, just go with the men, because I can't stop you. God gives us free will and He's consistent and true. He will try to discourage us. But in the end He says, listen, just go. But again, we get this little phrase here, don't forget the words that I give to you and tell you to speak. There's boundaries. There always is boundaries. But he sold himself to sin. And what we're going to see from this point, from that point there in verse 35, that Balaam becomes merely a tool. Merely a hard tool to do a job. And God's going to use him in a hard way. And he's going to learn the next lesson in a very hard way in chapter 23. Let's quickly get through our storyline to that point. God's going to work with him, and it's going to be at Balaam's expense in the end. I forgot one other point. The biggest problem here is that Balaam has no clue that he's crossed that line. Balaam doesn't realise that he's crossed a line in God's sight, because he just goes on with those princes from Balak. And that is the scariest part of this story to me. Because when we're so blindly obsessed with doing something, we don't know that we've crossed that line. We don't know when God said, well, you go your way. And Balaam went on with the princes of Balak thinking he's got his way. Albeit a little awkwardly, he's got what he wanted. I find that incredibly scary, because our next chapter will show us the spiral down to oblivion from here. But the joy is that it shows us that God is able to work in our lives and is so patient And even when we do cross that line, God can take bad curses and turn them into a blessing. And there's always a positive when we're willing to see God working in our lives. He's going to turn all the curses that Balaam intends to speak, he's going to turn them into a blessing for Israel, for his purpose, for his people, to help the ecclesia. Well, what happens in verse 36? Balak comes all the way out to meet him, to the extremity of Moab's border. That's what a king would do. He's paid a bucket load of money, he's sent all of his princes down and all of his nobles, and so it's only right that he'd go out and meet him out there on the border. You can imagine that scene. And Balak, in his positivity, turns up and says, "Didn't I call for you? Why did you come to me when I first called? Am I not good enough for you?" And then all these praising words, just like our employer would tell us, "I believe in you. You're going to change that office. You're going to make that division achieve incredible things." That's Balak. "Didn't I call for you? Aren't I able to honour you? Aren't I able to give you the opportunity of your lifetime? Come with us." And Balaam said to Balak, "I've come, but I can't say anything but what God tells me to say." That's awkward, isn't it? And that's because his conscience is still playing with him. He's still struggling with what he knows he should do, because he doesn't realise that he's crossed the line. "I can't speak anything but what the words that God puts into my mouth." And Balak goes, "Hey, that's cool. Doesn't matter. Come with us and let's go to Kiriath Huzoth." I don't know whether you have a translation in your Bible that helps us to understand what that name is. It's a little unusual why we're told this town. Essentially, it's a border town on the edge of two nations. And then the actual word means a place of streets and villages. And it's where all people of all different walks of life from different nationalities on the highway come and meet. And what happens in big cities like New York and London? Well, go to the types of places where everybody comes to meet in the street and find new experiences, like Las Vegas. Because that's what Kiriath Huzoth is. It's the red light district in our language. And that makes sense. Because how would a king of Moab, who's not known for morality, how would he welcome his guests? Oh, it's only natural. They'd have a great big feast. Because religion was pleasure for the Moabites. And you can imagine he puts on a great big dinner. And he offers oxen and sheep, and it's a great big celebration. And he sends some of it to Balaam and for the princes who were with him. Some of our study needs to be a little bit less, or maybe a little graphic. I'll leave it to your imagination. Was it just steaks that was sent to Balaam and the servants, the princes that were with him? Or was it the meat that was offered to idols and everything else that goes with it in a city like Vegas? And here's a man who's meant to worship Yahweh, who's turned his back on that and he's going to go his way to the world. And in that compromised position, he's going to be offered everything that this world says is the pleasures of this life. Why? Because they're the lusts of the flesh. And there is the lust of the flesh offered to him that night. And I'm going to suggest to you, and we'll come back to this later, that night is where Balaam learnt how to deceive the nation of Israel come Numbers chapter 25. It's a devastating thought. But the experience of that night laid the foundation for what Balaam is going to do in chapter 25 when he can't achieve his goals. And he's going to follow the same process with the nation of Israel to lead them down that path. I've seen my time, and I think we've got one last thing, though. We'll be able to just quickly squeeze in that last verse. I just want to show to you that the deception is all the way through the story. Verse 41. Why are we told in verse 41 that the next morning Balak took Balaam and brought him up to Bamoth Baal, and from there he could see what? Depends on your translation. Some might say the extremity, as if he could see it all. Some might say just the edge. Some might say only a corner. And the truth is, he was shown merely a glimpse. As the ESV says, he was shown merely a fraction of the nation of Israel. And we're going to see later that when Balaam, in chapter 24, when Balaam sees the whole camp of Israel and the 12 tribes, he's impressed. He looks at it and goes, it is just glorious the way they're set up. Balak knows that Israel is unique in its way of life, in the way its tents are set up. You can identify them under their encampments and their signs and their symbols and their structure and the order that they have. And ecclesial life is like that. When the people from this world come in and they look in at us, we're different. Maybe weird. It's okay. They can see we're different. And there's something about it. And Balak knew that. And so he only showed Balaam a fraction of the people. Come to 23 and at verse 13, what we'll find is the same thing happens. He takes him to a different place so that he cannot see all of the people. You can only see parts of the nation again. So remember earlier on we looked at how he didn't reveal the fact that it was the nation of Israel. He just said it's his tribe. I'll just show you. It's just a small little part. I should have showed that picture earlier. Sorry. There's the grandeur of the camp of Israel, and it was impressive, all centred around their worship. Chapter 24 and at verse 2, he looked out across the desert, finally, in chapter 24, and finally gets to see all the Israelites camping tribe by tribe. And it's reinforced in verse 5 how impressive that outlook was. You know, brothers and sisters, I keep repeating this same thing, that there is lessons in this man's life tucked away in the back of Numbers. It's not because I think it is, it's because Paul says to us it is. Paul says to us in Corinthians chapter 10 that these things are written down as examples for you and I. Paul tells us it's him, it's not me. And he says that we might not desire the evil things that they did, that we wouldn't be idolaters like some of them were. We must not indulge in the sexual immorality when 23,000 fell in one day. And that is the story of Balaam. These things are written for our example. And they're written down for our instruction on the edge of the kingdom age.